The year is 1942. World War II rages across the globe. In a secret laboratory at Harvard University, a brilliant chemist works tirelessly to create something new, a weapon that will give Allied forces an edge against the Axis powers. His name is Louis Pfizer, and he's about to change the face of modern warfare forever. What he doesn't yet know is that his creation will not only transform military tactics, but will also leave an indelible scar on his own conscience and on the bodies of countless victims across generations. This is the story of napalm, one of the most devastating incendiary weapons ever created. A substance so destructive it can burn through flesh, stick to skin, and continue burning underwater. A weapon so horrific that its very name would become synonymous with the worst atrocities of modern warfare. But it's also the story of a scientist caught between the pursuit of knowledge and the terrible consequences of his creation. A man who would live to see his invention used in ways he never imagined and would be forced to reckon with the moral implications of his work. Join me as we explore the fascinating and tragic story of Louis Pfizer and the development of napalm, the waterproof explosive that melts human skin. Louis Frederick Pfizer was born in Columbus, Ohio on April 7, 1899, at the dawn of a new century that would be defined by both incredible scientific progress and unprecedented human destruction. From an early age, Pfizer showed exceptional promise as a student. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Williams College in 1920, where he had also excelled as an athlete. His academic brilliance earned him a place at Harvard University, where he completed his Ph.D. under the renowned chemist James Bryant Conant in 1924. Pfizer's doctoral research focused on the measurement of oxidation potentials in quinone oxidation, hardly the kind of work that suggested a future in developing weapons of mass destruction. Following his Ph.D., he continued to build his academic credentials with postdoctoral work at prestigious institutions, including the University of Oxford and Frankfurt University. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Pfizer had established himself as a respected professor of organic chemistry at Harvard. His research had expanded into various areas, including the synthesis of vitamin K and work on anti-malarial drugs. His reputation was that of a dedicated scientist whose work promised to improve human health and welfare. But the war changed everything. Like many scientists of his generation, Pfizer felt a patriotic duty to contribute his expertise to the war effort. When the U.S. government approached him to work on a top-secret weapons project, he initially hesitated. "Now, I didn't like the idea of poison gases," Pfizer would later recall, "but I swallowed my pride and took the assignment." However, his focus would soon shift from poison gas to something potentially even more destructive: incendiary weapons. The U.S. military was interested in developing more effective fire-based weapons that could be used against enemy structures and fortifications. Traditional incendiary weapons like thermite were effective, but they had limitations. What was needed was something that could stick to surfaces, burn intensely even in wet conditions, and be relatively safe to handle before deployment. This challenge sparked Pfizer's scientific curiosity. Drawing on his deep knowledge of organic chemistry, he began to experiment with various compounds that might meet these requirements. Little did he know that his work would soon produce one of the most notorious weapons of the 20th century. On Valentine's Day 1942, in the basement of the Converse Chemistry Laboratory at Harvard University, Louis Pfizer and his associate E.B. Hirschberg achieved a breakthrough that would change modern warfare forever. They had created a sticky, gel-like substance that could adhere to surfaces while burning at temperatures of up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The creation process was deceptively simple. "It's quite simple," Pfizer would later explain. "You just take gasoline, sprinkle in some powder, and stir. First, it turns into a mixture the consistency of applesauce, and then you let it sit a while and it turns into a thick, tough gel." This powder was a mixture of aluminum salts derived from naphthenic and palmitic acids. Hence the name napalm, combining the na from naphthenic and palm from palmitic. The resulting gel had properties that were immediately recognized as militarily valuable. It stuck to surfaces, burned intensely for extended periods, and was remarkably waterproof. Initial testing was conducted in small-scale environments. Pfizer would test his compounds by burning them inside wooden frames, then measuring the weight of the frame afterward. The lighter the remaining wood, the more effective the incendiary compound had proven to be. Through this methodical process, Pfizer determined that his napalm formula was approximately 7 times more effective than thermite, the standard military incendiary at the time. The first major test of napalm occurred on July 4, 1942, Independence Day, on the Harvard football field near the business school. The symbolism of testing a new American weapon on the nation's birthday was not lost on those involved. The test was successful, demonstrating napalm's fearsome potential. Further tests followed at military facilities, including Jefferson Proving Ground and Dugway Proving Ground, where the new weapon was used against structures designed to replicate German and Japanese buildings. These tests confirmed what Pfizer and his team had already observed. Napalm was extraordinarily effective at igniting and destroying structures. The U.S. military quickly recognized the potential of this new weapon. By mid-1942, napalm was already being produced for military use, and by the end of the war, American forces were using 75 million pounds of it annually. Napalm bombs became a standard part of the U.S. arsenal, particularly in the Pacific Theater against Japanese targets. Pfizer continued to refine and develop napalm-based weapons throughout the war. Among his creations were the Harvard Candle, a napalm bomb with a match-head ignition system, and a miniature time-fused napalm bomb designed to be carried by bats, which would roost in enemy structures before the devices detonated, an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful project known as Project X-Ray. The development of napalm represented a perfect fusion of scientific innovation and military necessity. It was a triumph of applied chemistry, creating a substance that fulfilled specific tactical requirements that no previous weapon could match. But as the war progressed and napalm began to be used in combat, the human cost of Pfizer's invention would become increasingly apparent. While napalm was initially designed for use against structures and infrastructure, its effects on human beings soon became horrifyingly clear. When napalm comes into contact with human skin, it creates catastrophic injuries unlike almost any other weapon. The gel-like consistency of napalm allows it to adhere to skin, where it burns at temperatures that can exceed 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike liquid gasoline, which might run off a surface, napalm sticks and continues to burn. This property makes it particularly devastating to human tissue. When napalm burns on skin, it doesn't just cause surface damage, it burns through to the bone. The intense heat causes proteins in human tissue to denature and coagulate, effectively melting the flesh. The burning process doesn't stop until either the napalm is completely consumed or the flesh is entirely destroyed. The sticky nature of napalm also makes it nearly impossible to remove once it's ignited on skin. Victims who attempt to wipe it off only spread the burning gel to their hands. Those who try to douse the flames with water find it ineffective. Napalm continues to burn even when submerged, one of the properties that made it militarily valuable in the first place. Beyond the immediate burning effects, napalm creates a host of secondary injuries. The intense heat generates carbon monoxide, while simultaneously depleting oxygen from the surrounding air. In confined spaces, this can cause asphyxiation even for those not directly touched by the flames. The air in a napalm bombing area can contain 20% or more carbon monoxide. Medical professionals treating napalm burns face extraordinary challenges. The burns are exceptionally deep, often reaching muscle and bone. The wounds are prone to infection, and the extensive tissue damage makes healing difficult or impossible without extensive skin grafts. Many victims are left with horrific scarring and lifelong disabilities. Physicians for Social Responsibility have noted that burns from incendiary weapons like napalm are among the most difficult injuries to treat. The depth and extent of tissue damage, combined with the toxicity of the burning materials, create medical challenges that often exceed the capabilities of even advanced trauma care. For those who survive the initial burns, the psychological trauma can be as devastating as the physical injuries. The visible scarring and disfigurement can lead to social isolation, depression, and lifelong psychological distress. Survivors often report that the sound and smell of the burning napalm never leave their memory. Louis Pfizer, working in his laboratory at Harvard, was initially insulated from these realities. His focus was on the chemical properties and military effectiveness of his creation, not on its effects on human bodies. But as napalm began to be used in combat, the human toll of his invention would become increasingly difficult to ignore. The first military use of napalm occurred on December 15, 1943, in Sicily, Italy, where it was used to incinerate a wheat field believed to be concealing German forces. But it was in the Pacific theater that napalm would demonstrate its true destructive potential. As the war against Japan intensified, American military strategists faced a difficult challenge. Japanese cities were densely populated, with many structures built from highly flammable wood and paper. Conventional bombing had proven less effective than anticipated, and the human and material costs of a land invasion were projected to be enormous. In this context, U.S. Army Air Forces General Curtis LeMay developed a new strategy: the systematic firebombing of Japanese cities using napalm and other incendiary weapons. The goal was to destroy Japan's industrial capacity and civilian morale by creating massive urban firestorms. The campaign began in earnest on March 9–10, 1945, with the bombing of Tokyo. That night, 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers dropped nearly 1,700 tons of napalm-filled incendiary bombs on the Japanese capital. The resulting firestorm was catastrophic, with temperatures reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. The human toll was staggering. Approximately 100,000 people died in the Tokyo raid alone, more than would later be killed in the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Over 1 million were left homeless, as approximately 16 square miles of the city were reduced to ashes. Curtis LeMay would later write, "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo on that night of March 9–10 than went up in vapor at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined." Following the success of the Tokyo raid, the U.S. Army Air Forces continued the firebombing campaign. By the end of the war, 64 Japanese cities had been targeted, resulting in the deaths of approximately 330,000 Japanese civilians and the destruction of roughly 40% of Japan's urban areas. Curtis LeMay would later write, "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo on that night of March 9–10 than went up in vapor at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined." Following the success of the Tokyo raid, the U.S. Army Air Forces continued the firebombing campaign. By the end of the war, 64 Japanese cities had been targeted, resulting in the deaths of approximately 330,000 Japanese civilians and the destruction of roughly 40% of Japan's urban areas. The firebombing campaign remains one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in history, and napalm was its primary tool. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would later capture more attention in popular memory, historian Robert Neer has noted that the bomb got the press, but napalm did the work. For Louis Pfizer, the reports of napalm's effectiveness in destroying Japanese cities were initially a source of professional pride. His invention was helping to bring the war to a close, potentially saving American lives by reducing the need for a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland. Yet even as the war came to an end, with Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, the legacy of napalm was just beginning. Far from being retired after World War II, napalm would go on to become a standard weapon in the American arsenal, deployed in conflicts around the world for decades to come. Following World War II, many hoped that the horrors of global conflict were behind them. But by 1950, the world was once again divided, this time along ideological lines, in the growing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, the United States and other United Nations forces quickly intervened. The Korean War provided a new theater for the use of napalm, and American forces employed it extensively. In fact, the U.S. dropped more napalm on Korea than it had during the entire Pacific campaign of World War II. Approximately 32,000 tons, about twice the amount used against Japan. Napalm played a particularly crucial role in the Incheon landing of September 15, 1950, a bold amphibious assault led by General Douglas MacArthur that reversed the course of the early war. The day was unofficially dubbed Napalm Day due to the extensive use of the incendiary in supporting the landing forces and targeting North Korean positions. American pilots developed new tactics for delivering napalm, including low-altitude drops that maximized accuracy and effectiveness against enemy troops and fortifications. The weapon proved especially valuable in the mountainous Korean terrain, where conventional bombing was often less effective. North Korean and Chinese forces, lacking air power comparable to the United States, had little defense against napalm attacks. Survivors described the horror of seeing fellow soldiers engulfed in sticky fire that could not be extinguished. The psychological impact on troops who witnessed napalm attacks was profound, with many reporting intense fear of air raids. The effectiveness of napalm against human targets became increasingly clear during the Korean conflict. U.S. Air Force reports highlighted its ability to inflict mass casualties on enemy troops, especially when they were in exposed positions. One military assessment noted that napalm was the most devastating weapon employed in Korea. There can be no doubt that it has accounted for a high percentage of enemy casualties. Estimates suggest that napalm bombing may have contributed to as many as 20% of all North Korean civilian casualties during the war. General Curtis LeMay, who had overseen the firebombing of Japan, later claimed, "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burnt down every town in North Korea." For Louis Pfizer, the Korean War represented a continuation of napalm's military utility. His invention was proving its worth in yet another conflict, helping American and UN forces combat the spread of communism. At this point, Pfizer still viewed napalm primarily through the lens of its tactical effectiveness, rather than its humanitarian implications. But the extensive use of napalm in Korea also began to raise questions about the ethics of such a destructive weapon. Reports of civilian casualties and horrific burn injuries started to filter back to the United States, though they received relatively little public attention in the context of the broader Cold War struggle. The Korean War would eventually end in an armistice on July 27, 1953, leaving the peninsula divided much as it had been before the conflict. But napalm had firmly established itself as a standard component of American military operations, a development that would have profound consequences in the next major U.S. conflict in Southeast Asia. If Korea solidified napalm's place in the American arsenal, it was Vietnam that would forever change how the world viewed this devastating weapon. Between 1963 and 1973, American forces dropped approximately 388,000 tons of napalm on Vietnam, 10 times the amount used in Korea and nearly 20 times what was used in World War II. By the Vietnam era, napalm had evolved. The original formula developed by Pfizer had been replaced by Napalm B, sometimes called super napalm, which used polystyrene and benzene mixed with gasoline instead of the original palmitic acid formula. This newer version burned hotter, longer, and was even more difficult to extinguish. The use of napalm in Vietnam differed from previous conflicts in several important ways. First, it was employed much more extensively, becoming a routine part of American air operations. Second, it was used not just against military targets, but as part of a broader strategy to destroy the forest cover that concealed North Vietnamese forces and supply lines, what became known as defoliation operations. But perhaps most significantly, the Vietnam War coincided with the rise of television news coverage that brought the realities of war into American living rooms as never before. For the first time, civilians back home could see the effects of napalm on human beings, and the images were horrifying. The turning point in public perception came on June 8, 1972, when Associated Press photographer Nick Ut captured an image that would become one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. The photo showed 9-year-old Kim Phuc running naked down a road after being severely burned in a napalm attack on her village of Trong Bong. Her clothes had been burned off her body, and her skin was melting from the napalm burns. The photograph, titled The Terror of War, but often referred to as Napalm Girl, won the Pulitzer Prize and crystallized growing anti-war sentiment. For many Americans, this image put a human face on the abstract concept of collateral damage and forced a confrontation with the reality of napalm's effects on civilians, especially children. The Vietnam War also marked a turning point for Louis Pfizer himself. For years, he had been able to separate his scientific contribution from the human suffering it caused. But in June 1972, while reading the Boston Herald-Traveler, Pfizer learned that napalm had killed or maimed 20 civilians and soldiers in a single incident. This report apparently affected Pfizer deeply. He realized that his invention was being used as an anti-personnel weapon, not just to burn buildings as he had originally envisioned. He had never suspected that napalm could be useful to the United States because of the way it clung to people's skin while it burned, reported the Harvard Crimson in 1973. A week after reading this article, Pfizer took an extraordinary step. He wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon, urging him to pursue an international agreement to ban the use of napalm. "It seems to me desirable," he wrote, "to try to promote an international agreement to outlaw further use of napalm or napalm-type munitions." Nixon's science advisor, Edward E. Casa, failed to explode the report. He argued that napalm could be used as a, quote, white agent to burn buildings at night when the weather would not support smoke. Nixon could not be more interested. He wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon, urging him to pursue an international agreement to ban the use of napalm. "It seems to me desirable," he wrote, "to try to promote an international agreement to outlaw further use of napalm or napalm-type munitions." David Jr. replied the following month, acknowledging that the uses of napalm in Vietnam were difficult to predict or control, but assuring Pfizer that his suggestion would receive very careful attention. Pfizer later dismissed this as getting the brush off from Nixon, but his action represented a significant evolution in his thinking about his invention. By this time, napalm had become a symbol of American military excess in the Vietnam War. Protests against its manufacturer, Dow Chemical, became a common feature on college campuses. The company, which had won the contract to produce napalm in 1965, became the focus of intense criticism and boycotts. When the United States finally withdrew from Vietnam in 1975, the moral reckoning over napalm was just beginning. The weapon that had once been seen as a triumph of American scientific ingenuity was now widely viewed as a symbol of indiscriminate cruelty. As protests against napalm mounted during the Vietnam War, Louis Pfizer found himself increasingly questioned about his role in creating such a destructive weapon. His response to these questions reveals a man grappling with the moral implications of his work, sometimes with clarity, sometimes with ambivalence, and sometimes with a troubling detachment. In a 1967 interview with the Sunday Herald, Pfizer compared his situation to that of a rifle manufacturer. "The person who makes a rifle, he isn't responsible if it is used to shoot the president," he said. "I feel no guilt, and I would do it again if I were called upon." This stance, separating the invention from its applications, was one that many scientists involved in weapons development had adopted. By focusing on the technical challenge rather than the human consequences, they could maintain a sense of professional distance from the suffering their creations might cause. Yet Pfizer's letter to Nixon in 1972 suggests that this compartmentalization was beginning to break down. The realization that napalm was being used specifically to target human beings rather than structures clearly troubled him enough to take action, even if that action was ultimately ineffective. In a 1973 interview with the Harvard Crimson, Pfizer tried to explain his perspective. "I discovered that a gelled fuel burns more efficiently than a free fuel," he said, reducing his contribution to a matter of combustion efficiency rather than weapon design. Yet in the same interview, he acknowledged being disturbed by napalm's use as an anti-personnel weapon. This tension between scientific achievement and moral responsibility was hardly unique to Pfizer. Many scientists involved in the development of devastating weapons have faced similar dilemmas. Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita after witnessing the first nuclear test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, was reportedly so disturbed by a premature obituary that described him as a merchant of death that he established the Nobel Prizes to leave a more positive legacy. Ascanio Sobrero, who discovered nitroglycerin, was horrified by its destructive potential and tried to keep it secret. For Pfizer, there seems to have been a gradual evolution in his thinking. His initial pride in creating a weapon that helped win World War II gave way to a more nuanced view as napalm's use expanded and its human toll became clearer. Yet he never fully renounced his invention or accepted personal responsibility for its effects. In a particularly revealing comment, Pfizer once said, "I have no right to judge the morality of napalm just because I invented it." This statement captures the paradox at the heart of his position, claiming both the achievement of invention and a moral neutrality about its consequences. Pfizer continued his academic career at Harvard after the war, becoming a respected professor emeritus in 1968. He wrote influential textbooks with his wife, Mary, who was also a chemist, and made significant contributions to organic chemistry that had nothing to do with weapons development. But napalm would always be the invention for which he was best known and most criticized. When Louis Pfizer died in 1977 at the age of 78, his legacy was complex. He was remembered as a brilliant chemist whose work spanned many fields, from vitamin synthesis to explosive development. But he was also the man who created a weapon that had caused immense suffering around the world, a fact that no amount of scientific rationalization could fully address. The question of whether scientists bear moral responsibility for the applications of their discoveries remains as relevant today as it was during Pfizer's lifetime. His story stands as a cautionary tale about the complex intersection of science, warfare, and ethics, and the human capacity to both create and destroy. In the decades following the Vietnam War, napalm's reputation continued to evolve from a celebrated military innovation to a reviled symbol of inhumane warfare. This shift was reflected in both popular culture and international law. Films like Apocalypse Now, 1979, featured memorable napalm sequences, with Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore's famous line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," delivering a sardonic comment on American military attitudes. Musicians from the punk band Napalm Death to the rock group System of a Down referenced the weapon in their names and lyrics. The British street artist Banksy incorporated napalm imagery into his provocative works. By the late 20th century, growing international concern about weapons that cause unnecessary suffering had led to efforts to restrict or ban napalm's use. In 1980, Protocol 3 of the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons was adopted, prohibiting the use of incendiary weapons like napalm against civilian populations or in civilian areas. The United States, notably, did not ratify Protocol 3 until 2009, when President Barack Obama signed it on his first full day in office, a symbolic repudiation of napalm's place in American warfare. This marked a formal acknowledgement of what many had long argued, that napalm's indiscriminate effects and the suffering it caused placed it beyond the bounds of acceptable warfare. Despite these restrictions, variants of napalm continued to be used in conflicts around the world. During the Gulf War in 1991, Iraqi forces employed napalm against Kuwaiti oil fields. In the 2003 Iraq War, U.S. forces used Mark 77 firebombs, technically different from napalm but similar in effect, against Iraqi positions. Meanwhile, survivors of napalm attacks continue to live with the physical and psychological scars. Kim Phuc, the girl from the famous Vietnam War photograph, underwent numerous operations and eventually established the Kim Foundation International to provide medical and psychological assistance to children who are victims of war. Her journey from victim to advocate represents one of the more hopeful aspects of napalm's dark legacy. For scientists and engineers, the story of napalm offers important lessons about the ethical dimensions of technological innovation. It raises questions about the responsibility inventors bear for how their creations are used, and the importance of considering potential humanitarian impacts during the development process. Universities and research institutions have increasingly implemented ethics committees and review processes to address these concerns. Harvard University, where napalm was invented, now has explicit policies on research with potential weapons applications, policies that didn't exist when Louis Pfizer conducted his work in 1942. The scientific community continues to grapple with these issues as new technologies emerge. The development of autonomous weapon systems, cyber weapons, and biological engineering capabilities creates fresh ethical challenges for researchers. The legacy of napalm reminds us of the importance of addressing these questions proactively rather than after devastating consequences have already occurred. In the end, the story of napalm is not just about a particular weapon or its inventor. It's about the broader relationship between scientific innovation and human values, and the need to ensure that technological progress serves humanity's best interests rather than its worst impulses. The story of Louis Pfizer and napalm encapsulates one of the great paradoxes of scientific progress: how human ingenuity can create tools of both extraordinary benefit and terrible destruction. In his Harvard laboratory in 1942, Pfizer saw himself as a patriotic scientist applying his knowledge to help win a necessary war. The waterproof, sticky incendiary he developed was, from a purely technical perspective, a remarkable achievement, solving specific military challenges through clever chemical engineering. But as napalm spread beyond its original context, from the firebombing of Japanese cities to the jungles of Vietnam, its humanitarian costs became increasingly difficult to justify. The images of burning children and melting flesh forced a confrontation with the real-world consequences of what had begun as an abstract chemical problem. Pfizer's own journey, from proud inventor to troubled advocate for restrictions on his creation, reflects this broader awakening. His letter to Nixon requesting international controls on napalm came too late to prevent the suffering in Vietnam, but represented an important acknowledgement of the moral dimensions of his work. Today, as we grapple with the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, autonomous weapons, and other emerging technologies, the lessons of napalm remain relevant. Scientific innovation does not occur in a moral vacuum, and the responsibility for its applications cannot be so easily separated from the act of creation. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of napalm is this: it stands as a powerful reminder that in the pursuit of knowledge and technical achievement, we must never lose sight of our common humanity and the obligation to ensure that our creations serve life rather than destroy it. As we look to the future of science and technology, we would do well to remember the chemist who invented a waterproof explosive and lived long enough to see it melt human skin. Not as a simple cautionary tale, but as a complex reflection on the responsibilities that come with the power to innovate and change the world. The story of Louis Pfizer and napalm is ultimately about the choices we make, as scientists, as societies, and as human beings, and the values that guide those choices. In an age of ever-accelerating technological change, these are lessons we cannot afford to forget.